Every evening, when the last guest left the grand ballroom and the lights dimmed to a soft golden glow, an old woman would stop by the piano in the corner. She never sat down. She never touched the keys. She just stood there for a minute or two, looking at it like she was looking at an old friend she hadn't spoken to in years. Her name was Mei Lin, and she had worked as a cleaner at the Hartwell Hotel for 17 years. She was 62 years old, though the years had been harder on her than they should have been. Her hands were rough from scrubbing floors and polishing silver. Her back ached from bending over tables and reaching up to dust chandeliers. But she never complained. Not once. To the people who worked at the hotel, she was invisible. The managers walked past her, without a word. The waiters barely noticed when she refilled their supply closets. The guests, dressed in expensive suits and glittering dresses, looked right through her, as if she wasn't even there. And honestly, that was fine with her. She preferred it that way. Being invisible meant being safe. It meant no questions, no curious looks, no one digging into a past she had buried so deep she sometimes wondered if it had even happened at all. Mei Lin had come to America 23 years ago with nothing but a small suitcase and $200 hidden in her shoe. She didn't speak much English back then. She didn't know anyone. She had no family waiting for her, no job lined up, no plan for what came next. All she knew was that she couldn't stay where she was. The life she had built, the person she had been, it was all gone. And she had to start over. Even if starting over meant becoming no one at all. She found work wherever she could. She washed dishes at a restaurant in Chinatown. She cleaned offices at night. She knew 79 work. She took care of an elderly woman who lived alone in a small apartment and couldn't get out of bed anymore. The pay was never enough, but it was honest work, and it kept her moving forward. Then, 17 years ago, she got the job at the Hartwell Hotel. It was one of those grand old places that looked like it belonged in another century. The ceilings were high and covered with painted angels. The floors were made of white marble that echoed with every footstep. Crystal chandeliers hung in every room, catching the light and throwing tiny rainbows across the walls. The ballroom was the heart of the hotel. It was where the wealthy came to celebrate their weddings, their anniversaries, their business deals. On any given weekend, you could find politicians shaking hands with billionaires, celebrities laughing with fashion designers, and socialites showing off dresses that cost more than most people made in a year. And in the middle of it all, tucked into a corner near the tall windows, sat a piano. It was a Steinway Grand, over 80 years old, with a body made of deep black wood that gleamed like still water. The hotel had bought it decades ago from an estate sale, and it had been sitting in that same spot ever since. Sometimes a hired musician would play it during events. Sometimes it just sat there, silent and waiting. Mei Lin noticed it on her very first day. She had been mopping the floor near the windows when she saw it. Her heart stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she forgot where she was. She walked toward it slowly, like she was approaching something holy. Her fingers twitched at her sides. She could almost feel the cool touch of the keys beneath her hands, the familiar weight of the music waiting to pour out of her. But then she heard footsteps behind her. A manager was calling her name, telling her to finish up and move on to the next room. She blinked, shook her head, and walked away. She didn't touch the piano that day. She didn't touch it the next day either, or the day after that. In fact, she never touched it at all. But every night, after everyone was gone and the ballroom was empty, she would stop by and look at it. Just for a minute. Just to remember. You see, there was something about Mei Lin that no one at the hotel knew. Something she had never told anyone in America. Something she had tried so hard to forget that sometimes she almost believed she had imagined it. Before she was a cleaner, before she was a dishwasher, before she was a nobody scrubbing floors in a country that wasn't her own, Mei Lin had been someone. Back in China, in another life, she had been a concert pianist. She had started playing when she was just 4 years old. Her mother had saved up for months to buy a second-hand piano from a neighbor who was moving away. It was old and out of tune, with a few keys that stuck when you pressed them. But to little Maylin, it was the most beautiful thing in the world. She practiced every day. Before school, after school, late into the night, when everyone else was asleep. Her fingers flew across the keys, like they had been born to do nothing else. By the time she was 12, she was performing in front of audiences. By 18, she had won national competitions. By 25, she was playing in concert halls across Asia and Europe, her name printed in programs and newspapers, her face known to music lovers around the world. Those were the golden years. The years when everything seemed possible, when the music flowed through her like water, and every performance felt like flying. But golden years don't last forever. Political troubles came, the kind of troubles that don't care how talented you are or how hard you've worked, the kind that can take everything away in a single night. Maylin lost her career. She lost her home. She lost people she loved, people she would never see again. And so she ran. She left behind everything she had ever known. Her piano, her music, her name. She buried it all so deep that she sometimes went whole weeks without thinking about it. But the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. Every time she walked past that Steinway in the ballroom, her fingers would twitch. Every time she heard music playing from the speakers during an event, her heart would ache with a longing she couldn't name. She told herself it was better this way. She was too old now, too out of practice. Her hands were stiff from years of hard work. Even if she tried to play, she probably couldn't anymore. Besides, who would want to hear an old cleaning lady play piano? The thought was almost funny. She could picture the looks on their faces, the confusion, the pity, maybe even the laughter. No, it was better to stay invisible, better to keep her head down and do her job and not dream about things that were gone forever. That's what she told herself every night as she stood by the piano. That's what she believed. Until the night everything changed. It started like any other evening at the Hartwell Hotel. The ballroom was being prepared for the biggest event of the year, the annual charity gala. 300 of the city's richest and most powerful people were about to walk through those doors. And Maylin had no idea that in just a few hours, her entire life was about to be turned upside down. The annual charity gala was the biggest night of the year at the Hartwell Hotel. Everyone who was anyone wanted to be there. Politicians, business owners, famous actors, wealthy families who had more money than they knew what to do with. They came dressed in their finest clothes, dripping with diamonds and gold, ready to write checks with lots of zeros and feel good about themselves. For the hotel staff, it was the most stressful night of the year. Everything had to be perfect. The flowers had to be fresh. The silverware had to shine. The champagne had to be cold. One small mistake, one wrinkled tablecloth, one smudge on a wine glass, and someone would notice. Someone always noticed. Maylin had been working since 6 in the morning. She had polished every inch of the ballroom floor until it gleamed like glass. She had dusted the chandeliers, arranged the centerpieces, and checked every single chair to make sure it was perfectly aligned with the others. By 5 in the evening, her back was screaming and her feet felt like they were on fire. But there was still more to do. There was always more to do. She was arranging the last of the white roses on the head table when she heard raised voices coming from the hallway. At first, she didn't pay attention. People were always yelling about something before big events. But then, she recognized one of the voices. It belonged to Mr. Davenport, the hotel's general manager. Mr. Davenport was a tall man in his 50s, with silver hair and a permanent frown. He wore expensive suits and walked like he owned the world. In the 17 years Maylin had worked at the hotel, she could count on one hand the number of times he had spoken to her directly. To him, she was just part of the furniture, something to be used and ignored. But right now, Mr. Davenport didn't sound like a man who owned the world. He sounded like a man who was about to fall apart. "What do you mean he's not coming?" He was shouting into his phone. "The guests arrive in 40 minutes. 40 minutes. Maylin kept her head down and continued arranging the flowers, but she couldn't help listening. "I don't care if he has food poisoning. Find someone else. Anyone else." There was a pause. Then Mr. Davenport let out a sound that was somewhere between a groan and a scream. "This is a disaster," he muttered, ending the call. He stood in the doorway of the ballroom, rubbing his forehead like he was trying to push away a headache. A young woman from the events team hurried over to him. "Sir, what's wrong? What happened?" "The pianist," Mr. Davenport said through gritted teeth. "The pianist we hired for tonight. He's sick. He's not coming." The young woman's face went pale. "But we need live music. It's tradition. The donors expect it." "I know what they expect." "Mr. Davenport snapped. "Do you think I don't know that? 300 guests, the biggest donors in the city, and we're going to have them sitting in silence like it's a funeral." He started pacing back and forth, his shoes clicking sharply on the marble floor. "Call every musician in the city, every pianist, every violinist, I don't care. Find someone who can be here in 30 minutes. The young woman nodded and rushed off, already dialing numbers on her phone. Mei Lin watched all of this from the corner of her eye. Her hands had stopped moving. The white rose she was holding trembled slightly between her fingers. She knew she should stay quiet. She knew she should finish her work and disappear into the background like she always did. That was the safe thing to do, the smart thing. But something was stirring inside her. Something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She looked across the ballroom at the piano. The Steinway. It sat there in its corner, silent and waiting, just like it had been waiting for 17 years. Her heart began to beat faster. Her palms felt sweaty. A voice in her head was screaming at her to stop, to walk away, to mind her own business. But another voice, a quieter one. What if? Before she could talk herself out of it, Maylin set down the rose and walked toward Mr. Davenport. He didn't notice her at first. He was still pacing, still muttering to himself about disasters and ruined reputations. She had to clear her throat twice before he finally looked up. When he saw her, his expression shifted to confusion, like he was trying to figure out why a piece of furniture was suddenly talking to him. "What is it?" he asked impatiently. "I'm busy." Maylin's mouth felt dry. The words stuck in her throat. For a moment, she almost turned around and walked away. But then she thought about the piano. She thought about all those nights standing beside it, remembering, longing, wishing for just one more chance. "I can play," she said quietly. Mr. Davenport blinked. "Excuse me?" "The piano." Maylin's voice was steadier now. "I can play something. If you need someone." For a few seconds, Mr. Davenport just stared at her. His eyes moved from her face to her worn uniform, to her rough hands, to the mop bucket sitting a few feet away. She could see exactly what he was thinking. She could see the doubt, the disbelief, maybe even a little bit of amusement. "You," he said slowly. "You can play piano." It wasn't really a question. It was more like he was testing the words to see if they made any sense. "Yes," Maylin said. "I learned a long time ago. I can play something simple. Background music. Just until you find someone else." Mr. Davenport let out a short laugh. Not a kind one. The kind of laugh people make when they think something is ridiculous but they're too polite to say so. "Look," he said. "I appreciate the offer. But this is a very important event. These guests expect a certain level of quality. I'm sure you understand." Maylin felt her cheeks burn. She understood perfectly. He didn't think she was good enough. He looked at her and saw an old cleaning woman with calloused hands and a faded uniform. He couldn't imagine that she might be anything more than that. Part of her wanted to argue. Part of her wanted to tell him exactly who she used to be, what she used to do. the stages she had played on, and the crowds she had moved to tears. But she didn't. She just nodded and took a step back. "Of course," she said quietly. "I understand." She turned to walk away. Her heart was sinking. The brief spark of hope that had flickered inside her was already dying out. But then something happened. The young woman from the events team came rushing back into the ballroom. Her face was flushed, and she was out of breath. "Sir," she said, "I've called everyone, every agency, every contact we have. No one is available on this short notice. There's no one." Mr. Davenport's face went white. For a moment, he looked like he might actually be sick. The guests would start arriving in less than 30 minutes. 300 of the city's most important people, and there would be no music. Just the awkward sound of clinking glasses and forced conversation. He stood there frozen, his mind racing through options that didn't exist. And then, slowly, his eyes moved back to Maylin. She had stopped a few feet away. She was standing very still, waiting. Mr. Davenport looked at her for a long moment. She could see the battle happening behind his eyes. Pride fighting against desperation. Doubt wrestling with necessity. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh. "Fine," he said, the word coming out like it physically hurt him. Maylin's heart jumped. "But," Mr. Davenport added quickly, holding up a finger, "just simple background music. Nothing fancy. Nothing complicated. Just blend in. Don't draw attention to yourself. And for God's sake, don't embarrass us." Maylin nodded. "I understand." "Good." Mr. Davenport was already turning away, already moving on to the next crisis. "Just stay in the corner and keep it quiet." He walked off without another word, leaving Maylin standing alone in the middle of the ballroom. She looked across the room at the piano. After 17 years of standing beside it, after 17 years of remembering and longing and telling herself it was over, she was finally going to play again. Her hands were shaking. Her heart was pounding so hard, she could hear it in her ears. She didn't know what was going to happen next. She didn't know if her fingers would even remember what to do after all these years. But as she walked toward the piano and sat down on the bench for the first time in over 2 decades, one thought kept running through her mind. This was it. This was her moment, and she wasn't going to waste it. Maylin sat down on the piano bench and felt the world go quiet. The cushion was soft beneath her. The black and white keys stretched out in front of her like an old road she hadn't traveled in years. She placed her hands in her lap and just looked at them for a moment. These hands. They were so different now. The skin was rough and dry. The knuckles were swollen, from years of scrubbing and lifting and working in the cold. There were small scars from cleaning chemicals and cuts from broken glass. These were not the hands of a concert pianist. These were the hands of a cleaning woman. A nobody. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Behind her, she could hear the first guests arriving. The sound of expensive shoes on marble, the rustle of silk dresses, polite laughter, and the clink of champagne glasses being filled. 300 people were about to fill this room. 300. Wealthy, powerful, important people who had paid thousands of dollars to be here tonight. And she was supposed to provide the music, her stomach twisted with fear. What was she thinking? She hadn't played in over 20 years. Her fingers were stiff. Her memory was rusty. She was going to make a fool of herself in front of everyone. Maybe she should just get up and walk away. Tell Mr. Davenport she had changed her mind. Go back to being invisible. But then her fingers moved on their own. Without even thinking about it, she reached out and touched one of the keys. The note rang out, soft and clear, and something inside her woke up. It was like a door opening in a room that had been locked for decades. Light flooding into darkness. Air rushing into lungs that had forgotten how to breathe. She pressed another key. Then another. Her fingers began to move across the keyboard, slowly at first, then with growing confidence. She started with something simple, just like Mr. Davenport had asked. A gentle melody. Soft background music. The kind of thing you hear in elevators and hotel lobbies. Nothing special. Nothing that would draw attention. The guests continued to arrive. They chatted and laughed and sipped their drinks. No one looked at the corner where an old woman in a faded uniform was playing the piano. No one noticed her at all. And that was fine. That was the plan. Mei Lin kept her head down and played. The music flowed out of her, quiet and unassuming. She was doing exactly what she had been told to do. Blending in, staying invisible. But as the minutes passed, something began to change. The music started to pull at her. It was like a voice whispering in her ear, calling her back to a place she had left behind long ago. The melodies she was playing felt hollow, empty, like eating food with no taste or drinking water with no wetness. This wasn't music. This was noise. Pretty noise, but noise all the same. Her fingers hesitated on the keys. The simple melody faded into silence. For a moment, she just sat there, her hands hovering over the keyboard. The chatter of the guests filled the air around her. No one noticed that the music had stopped. Mei Lin looked down at her hands. Those rough, worn, scarred hands, and she made a decision. She wasn't going to play safe anymore. She wasn't going to hide. Not tonight. Maybe not ever again. She took a deep breath, placed her fingers on the keys, and began to play. But this time, she didn't play background music. This time, she played Chopin. The first notes of the ballade. No. 1-inch G minor floated out into the ballroom like smoke. Soft at first. Gentle. Almost hesitant. It was one of the most difficult pieces ever written for piano. A work of such emotional depth and technical complexity that many professional pianists spent years trying to master it. It required speed, precision, power, and above all, feeling. And Mei Lin had once played it in the greatest concert halls in the world. Her fingers moved across the keys like water flowing over stones. The melody grew, building slowly, note by note, phrase by phrase. It was the sound of longing, of loss, of a heart that had been broken and was trying to remember how to beat again. Somewhere in the ballroom, a woman stopped talking mid-sentence. She turned her head toward the corner, a confused look on her face. Then another guest noticed. And another. The melody kept building. Mei Lin's fingers danced faster now, flying over the black and white keys with a speed and grace that seemed impossible for someone her age. The music filled the room, rising up to the painted ceiling, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers, wrapping around every person in the ballroom like a warm embrace. One by one, conversations died. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. 300 people slowly turned toward the corner, where an old cleaning woman was playing the piano like her life depended on it. And maybe it did. The piece moved into its middle section, where the melody became faster and more intense. Mei Lin's hands were a blur. Her eyes were closed. She wasn't in the ballroom anymore. She was somewhere else entirely, somewhere far away and long ago. She was on stage in Shanghai, 19 years old, playing for a crowd of thousands. She was in Vienna, in a concert hall that had hosted the greatest musicians in history. She was in her mother's tiny apartment, practicing on that old broken piano while her mother sat in the corner and cried tears of joy. The music poured out of her like a river that had been dammed for decades and was finally breaking free. In the ballroom, people were crying. They didn't know why. They couldn't explain it. But the music was doing something to them. It was reaching inside their chests and squeezing their hearts. It was pulling up memories and feelings they had buried long ago. A businessman in an expensive suit wiped his eyes with his handkerchief. A woman in a diamond necklace felt tears rolling down her cheeks and didn't even bother to wipe them away. Even Mr. Davenport stood frozen near the entrance, his mouth hanging open, unable to believe what he was hearing. This wasn't background music. This wasn't simple. This wasn't blending in. This was magic. The piece built toward its climax. The notes came faster and faster, louder and louder. Mei Lin's whole body was moving with the music. Her shoulders, her arms, her head. She was lost in it, consumed by it. And then came the final section. The thundering chords, the crashing waves of sound. Her fingers hammered the keys with a power that seemed to shake the very walls of the ballroom. It was fury and sorrow and joy and pain all mixed together. It was everything she had lost and everything she had survived. It was 20 years of silence pouring out in a flood of music that nobody in that room would ever forget. And then, finally, the last note. It hung in the air for what felt like forever. Soft, fragile, like a single tear falling in slow motion. Then silence. Complete and total silence. Mei Lin sat at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys, her chest heaving, her eyes wet with tears she hadn't even realized she was crying. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And then the ballroom erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It wasn't the kind of clapping people do when they're being nice. It was something else entirely. It was 300 people jumping to their feet and cheering like they had just witnessed a miracle. Because in a way, they had. The sound crashed over Mei Lin like a wave. She looked up, blinking in confusion, like she was waking from a dream. She saw the standing crowd. She saw the tears on their faces. She saw Mr. Davenport staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know what to say. So she just sat there, her rough hands still resting on the keys of the piano she had loved in secret for 17 years. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. But what happened next would change her life in ways she never could have imagined. Because in that crowd of 300 people, there was one woman who wasn't just crying. She was watching, studying, and she had a question burning in her mind. Who was this cleaning woman? And how did she learn to play like that? The applause went on and on. Mei Lin sat frozen at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys, her mind struggling to understand what was happening. 300 people were on their feet. Some of them were cheering. Some of them were wiping tears from their faces. A few were even pushing their way toward the corner where she sat, trying to get closer to her. She didn't know what to do. She had spent so many years being invisible that she had forgotten what it felt like to be seen. And now, suddenly, every eye in the room was fixed on her. She wanted to run. She wanted to disappear back into the shadows where she belonged. But her legs wouldn't move. Her body felt heavy, like it was made of stone. Then she saw her coming. A woman was pushing through the crowd with purpose. She was maybe 50 years old, with sharp eyes behind stylish glasses and silver hair cut short. She wore a simple black dress. But there was something about the way she carried herself that said she was important, that she was someone who was used to being listened to. The woman stopped a few feet from the piano and stared at Mei Lin with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Who are you?" the woman asked. Her voice was direct, almost demanding. Mei Lin opened her mouth, but no words came out. What was she supposed to say? "I'm nobody. I'm the cleaning lady. I'm just someone who used to be someone a long time ago." The woman took another step closer. "That piece you just played, Chopin's Ballade. No. 1. Do you have any idea how difficult that is? Professional pianists spend years mastering it. Some never get it right." Mei Lin looked down at her hands. Those rough, worn hands that had just done something she wasn't sure she could still do. "I used to play," she said quietly. "A long time ago." The woman's eyes narrowed. She was studying Mei Lin like a detective studying a clue, like she was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite make sense. "Used to play where?" the woman pressed. "Who taught you? Where did you study?" By now, a small crowd had gathered around them. Mr. Davenport was there, still looking stunned. Other guests were leaning in. whispering to each other, trying to hear what was being said. Mei Lin felt trapped. The attention was suffocating. All these eyes on her, all these questions, all this pressure to explain herself. For 20 years, she had kept her past locked away. She had buried it so deep that sometimes she almost forgot it was there. And now, this woman wanted her to dig it all up in front of 300 strangers. "Please," Mei Lin said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to talk about it." But the woman wasn't giving up. She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, holding it up so Mei Lin could see. "My name is Dr. Helen Wu," she said. "I'm the chief music critic for the City Herald. I've reviewed performances in every major concert hall in the world. I've heard the greatest pianists of our generation play that exact piece." She paused, her eyes locked on Mei Lin's face. "And I have never heard anyone play it the way you just did." The crowd around them had grown larger. People were straining to hear. Phones were out, recording everything. Dr. Wu leaned closer, her voice softer now but no less intense. "Please," she said, "tell me who you are." Mei Lin closed her eyes. Her heart was pounding. Her hands were shaking. She could feel the weight of her past pressing down on her, demanding to be released. And suddenly, she was tired. Tired of hiding. Tired of pretending. Tired of being nobody when she had once been somebody. She opened her eyes and looked at Dr. Wu. "My name is Mei Lin Zhou," she said slowly. "I was born in Shanghai. I started playing piano when I was 4 years old." The room had gone completely silent. 300 people were holding their breath. By the time I was 18, I was performing in concert halls across Asia. By 25, I had played in Vienna, in Paris, in London. I won competitions. I was in newspapers. People knew my name. Her voice caught. The memories were flooding back now, and they hurt more than she had expected. But then things changed. Political troubles came. I was labeled as someone dangerous, someone who needed to be silenced. I lost my position. I lost my right to perform. I lost everything. Tears were streaming down her face now, but she didn't wipe them away. She just kept talking, the words pouring out of her like water through a broken dam. "I had to leave. I had to run. I came to America with nothing. No money, no family, no future. And I never played again. Not for 20 years. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the waiters had stopped circulating with their champagne trays. "Until tonight," Mei Lin finished, her voice barely a whisper. For a long moment, nobody said anything. The silence was heavy. It pressed down on the room like a physical weight. But it wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was something else. Something deeper. It was the silence of 300 people finally understanding. Finally seeing the woman in front of them, not as a cleaning lady, not as a mystery, but as a human being. Someone who had lost everything and survived. Someone who had carried unimaginable pain in silence for decades. Someone who had just shared the deepest wound of her heart with a room full of strangers. Then Dr. Wu did something unexpected. She started to clap. Not the thunderous applause from before. Just a slow, steady clapping. Respectful, reverent. One by one, others joined in. The applause built slowly. Not wild and chaotic like before, but measured and meaningful. It wasn't applause for a performance. It was applause for a life, for survival, for the courage it took to sit at that piano and play after 20 years of silence. Mei Lin sat there and let the sound wash over her. She felt something shifting inside her. Something that had been locked away for so long was finally breaking free. When the applause finally faded, Dr. Wu reached out and gently took Mei Lin's hand. "I would like to write your story," she said. "Not just about tonight. About all of it. About who you were and who you are. Would you let me do that? About all. About all. 1C. About all. Would you let me do that? Maylin looked at this stranger who had somehow seen through all her walls. She thought about the life she had been living. The early mornings, the mop buckets, the invisibility. She thought about the piano she had loved in secret for 17 years. And she thought about what it had felt like to finally play again. To let the music pour out of her like it had been waiting all this time. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if she was ready for her story to be told. But she knew one thing for certain. She was done hiding. Yes, she said softly. Dr. Wu smiled. And there was something warm in her eyes. Not pity. Not curiosity. Just understanding. Good, she said. Because the world needs to hear it. That night, after everyone had gone home and the ballroom was empty again, Maylin stayed behind. She told the night security guard she needed to clean up a few things. He nodded and left her alone. But she didn't clean anything. She walked to the piano one more time. The Steinway, her old friend. She sat down on the bench and placed her hands on the keys. She thought about everything that had happened. The performance, the applause, the questions. She thought about the little girl she had been, practicing on a broken piano in a tiny apartment while her mother cried happy tears. She thought about the woman she had become, scrubbing floors and polishing silver and pretending she was nobody. And she thought about the woman she might be able to become now. Someone who didn't have to hide. Someone who could let herself be heard. The story wasn't over. She knew that. Whatever came next, it would be hard, painful, maybe even terrifying. But for the first time in 20 years, she wasn't afraid. She had played again. She had told her truth. She had been seen, and the silence that followed had said everything. The weeks after the gala were a blur. Maylin's story had spread far beyond the walls of the Hartwell Hotel. The music critic's article had gone viral. Newspapers picked it up. Television stations called. Everyone wanted to talk to the cleaning woman who had made 300 wealthy strangers cry with nothing but a piano and her two worn hands. Invitations poured in from everywhere. Concert halls, music festivals, television shows, universities. People she had never met were sending her letters, emails, messages on social media accounts that strangers had created in her name. They all wanted the same thing. They wanted her to perform. At first, Maylin didn't know what to do. The attention was overwhelming. She had spent 20 years hiding, staying invisible, keeping her head down, and now suddenly the whole world wanted to look at her. Part of her was terrified. Part of her wanted to go back to her quiet life, her early mornings, and her mop bucket, and her silent evenings by the piano she never touched. But another part of her, a part she had kept buried for so long, was starting to wake up. She turned down most of the invitations. The big concert halls, the television appearances, the offers from agents who promised to make her famous again. None of it felt right. That wasn't why she had sat down at that piano. That wasn't what the music was for. But then one invitation came that she couldn't ignore. It was from a small community center in a neighborhood on the other side of the city. A poor neighborhood. Mostly immigrants. Families who had come to America the same way Maylin had. With nothing. With hope. With dreams that often got crushed under the weight of just trying to survive. The community center ran a free music program for children. Kids who couldn't afford lessons. Kids whose parents worked 2 or 3 jobs and didn't have time to drive them to fancy music schools. Kids who had never touched a real piano in their lives. The woman who ran the program had seen the news about Maylin. She had written a simple letter, handwritten on notebook paper, asking if Maylin would consider coming to play for the children. Just once. Just so they could see that someone who looked like them, someone who had struggled like their parents, could create something beautiful. Maylin read that letter 7 times, and then she said yes. The community center was nothing like the Hartwell Hotel. The floors were scuffed linoleum instead of polished marble. The ceiling had water stains. The chairs were old and mismatched, donated from churches and schools that didn't need them anymore. And the piano was not a vintage Steinway. It was a battered upright that had seen better days. It reminded Mei-Lin of the piano her mother had bought all those years ago. The one with the sticky keys that she had loved more than anything in the world. When she walked into the room, 30 children were waiting for her. They sat in those mismatched chairs, their eyes wide with curiosity. Some of them were fidgeting. Some of them were whispering to each other. A few of the older ones looked skeptical, like they weren't sure why they had been dragged here to listen to some old lady play piano. Their parents stood along the walls, tired faces, rough hands, the kind of people who worked long hours for little pay and still somehow found time to bring their children to a free music program on a Saturday afternoon. Mei-Lin looked at them and saw herself. She saw the person she had been 23 years ago, stepping off a plane with nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart. The woman who ran the program introduced her. She talked about the gala, about the article, about how Mei-Lin had once been a famous pianist in China. The children listened politely, but Mei-Lin could tell they didn't really understand. To them, she was just another adult, another person telling them to sit still and pay attention. When the introduction was over, everyone looked at Mei-Lin expectantly. She walked to the piano and sat down on the creaky bench. The children watched. The parents watched. The room was silent except for the hum of the old radiator in the corner. Mei-Lin placed her hands on the keys, and then she did something she hadn't planned. Instead of playing, she turned around to face the children. "I want to tell you something," she said. Her voice was soft, but it carried through the quiet room. "When I was your age, I had nothing. My family was poor. We lived in a tiny apartment. My mother worked so hard that sometimes she was too tired to eat dinner." The children were listening now, really listening. "But my mother believed in me," Mei-Lin continued. "She saved every penny she could, for months and months, just to buy me an old piano. It wasn't a nice piano. It was broken and out of tune. But to me, it was the most beautiful thing in the world." She paused, looking at their faces. Some of them were nodding. Some of them had tears in their eyes. They understood. They knew what it meant to have so little and to dream of so much. "I practiced every day," Mei-Lin said. "Before school, after school, late at night when everyone else was sleeping. And slowly, I got better. And one day, I was good enough to play in front of thousands of people." She turned back to the piano and ran her fingers lightly over the chipped keys. "But then I lost everything. I had to leave my country. I had to leave my music. I came here with nothing, just like your parents did. And for 20 years, I didn't play. I was scared. I thought that part of my life was over." She looked back at the children one more time. "But I was wrong. The music never left me. It was always here, waiting. And now I want to share it with you." She turned to face the piano, took a deep breath. She didn't play Chopin this time. She didn't play anything complicated or impressive. Instead, she played a simple melody, a folk song her mother used to sing to her when she was small, a song about hope and perseverance and believing in tomorrow even when today was hard. The notes floated through the room like sunlight through a window, gentle, warm. The children sat perfectly still. The fidgeting stopped. The whispering stopped. Even the skeptical older kids were leaning forward in their chairs, their eyes fixed on the old woman at the broken piano. The parents along the walls were crying, silent tears rolling down weathered cheeks. They heard something in that music that words could never express. They heard their own stories, their own struggles, their own hopes for their children. The song was short, just a few minutes. But when Mei-Lin played the last note and lifted her hands from the keys, something remarkable happened. Nobody clapped. Nobody moved. Nobody made a sound. The room was completely silent. But it wasn't an awkward silence. It wasn't the silence of confusion or disappointment. It was the silence of something sacred. The silence that comes after a prayer. after a confession, after a moment so pure and true that words would only ruin it. Maylin sat at the piano, her back still to the audience, and she understood. This was why she had come. Not for the applause, not for the fame, not for the concert halls and the television cameras. She had come for this. For these children, for these families, for this moment of connection that money couldn't buy and words couldn't describe. After a long moment, the silence broke. Not with applause, but with something better. A small girl in the front row, maybe 6 or 7 years old, stood up from her chair and walked toward the piano. She stood next to Maylin and looked up at her with big, serious eyes. "Can you teach me?" she asked. Maylin felt her heart crack open. She looked at this little girl, this child who reminded her so much of herself, and she knew, in that moment, exactly what she was meant to do. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I can teach you." 3 months later, Maylin stood in front of her first real class. 15 students, ranging from 6 to 16. Children of immigrants. Children with nothing but dreams. She had left her job at the Hartwell Hotel. She didn't need it anymore. The community center had given her a permanent position. The pay was small, but it was enough, and the work was more meaningful than anything she had ever done. She looked at her students, their eager faces, their hopeful eyes, and she smiled. "Music," she told them, "is not about being seen. It is about being heard. And every one of you has something worth hearing." She sat down at the old upright piano, placed her worn hands on the chipped keys, and began to play. No longer invisible, no longer forgotten. Finally, exactly where she belonged.